Welcome, as Jordan already said, this is week 2 of Forest City Church, and if you're going to ask if we're going to say that every week from now on, when I first got married, I was like, good morning. It's been a week since we've been married. Oh, we're a little, is that me? I'll just keep going, okay. And then it's like, we're 2 weeks married. It's been a month. But we're 10 years married now, and I stopped doing it like last month, so it does end eventually. Anyways, last week we dove into the beginning of this fall series that we're doing called A Spectator's Look at Jesus. And we're really wanting to unpack who is Jesus, who was Jesus, and we're going to be looking at him through a variety of different lenses and titles. And as Jordan said last week, he was quoting Time magazine as they call him the most influential person who has ever lived. And as such, it causes us to wonder that in the age of information, in an age where we can get any book, podcast, TikTok, YouTube video, we have an endless amount of information about how to live life well. Why do we even bother to consider Jesus, to follow Jesus? A Jewish carpenter from 2,000 years ago. I don't know if you're ever sitting in a waiting room somewhere and you look at the magazines, you realize they're like 2 years old. You're like, ugh, that's out of date. 2,000 years ago is when Jesus walked on this earth, and yet we're still influenced every day by this man. You might think, well, I've actually never been in church before. I don't actually have a lot to really go on about Jesus at all. I don't think he influences me much. Your entire calendar is influenced AD and BC, before Christ and after death. That is how the world today actually marks the passage of time, is through the birth and death of Jesus. So what are we to think? That a man of completely forgettable origins, he wasn't royalty, he wasn't of political high society, and he came into the world not in a violent, angry way, but with meekness and humble beginnings, born in a stable. Even if you haven't been in church before, I'm sure you've seen a nativity on somebody's lawn. Who has risen above every other title of guru or God or teacher or prophet. He has continued to bubble up again and again and again when the majority have faded into obscurity as time goes on. Why? Why are we still talking about him? And I think the reason we're still talking about him, at least in my humble opinion, is because Jesus made a claim that no other person, spiritual leader, life guru, has made. That Jesus is the Son of God. That he is, in fact, one with God. That's a pretty significant claim to make. If you've been in church, you're probably used to hearing, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Son of God. That's probably common language for you. But as we unpack this series, as we take a spectator's look at who Jesus is, there are two components that we feel we need to establish right off the bat. That they are two pieces of who Jesus was, God's divinity, also his humanity. Because these are the pillars, these are the doorway in which we enter every other aspect of who Jesus was and why he's significant. So next week, Jordan's going to unpack Jesus' humanity. Sorry, spoiler alert, Jordan, if that was like a surprise. But I, this week, have the small task of unpacking who Jesus is in respect to Jesus' divinity. Jesus as divine, Jesus as God. So I'm glad that you've all given me your next 3.5 days as we unpack this. I'm going to do my very best to keep this as short as possible. I love the expression. It's so fitting in this moment. I'm going to try to put the ocean in a shot glass for you. Hopefully, I will be concise. Because Jesus' audacious claims about himself pose what may be the central problem in all of history. The dividing point between Christianity and all other religions. Because the divinity of Christ is at the very center of Christian theology. Since Christians are by very definition believers in and followers of Christ, their understanding of Christ must must be central and determinative to the very character of the Christian faith. So therefore, that means for every individual in this room, Christian or not, there comes a point when we must wrestle with the claims and the realities of Jesus. Is he truly God? It is the thing that sets him apart from all others, all other teachers, all other spiritual leaders. If he claims to be God, that's a pretty big sticking point. This continues to be one of the most controversial topics, is the deity of Christ. It is at the same time, this is one of my favorite quotes from a little textbook called Introducing Christian Doctrine. It says, one of the most controversial topics here is the deity of Christ. It is the same time one of the most crucial. It lies at the heart of our faith, for our faith rests on Jesus actually being God in human flesh, and not simply just an extraordinary human, albeit one of the most unusual persons that ever lived. So if this man actually had this much influence on history, and he's said these things that seem to have held up over time, could his claims be true? All of them? Not just loving your neighbor or, turning the other cheek, but actually that he's God? Because if that is true, friends, I'm here to tell you today that that has significant implications on how we live our lives. So I want to spend the rest of our time unpacking the first aspect of who Jesus is, as Jesus is divine, because it lays that foundation, the precedent, and the authority for everything else and every other lens that we will look at who Jesus is. Now, I understand that there's going to be some people in this room that feel like, okay. I'm totally happy with Buddy Jesus. Jesus is a friend, that's wonderful, a life coach, a mentor, that is fine. We can easily put Jesus' sayings up there with the likes of Oprah or Gandhi or Tony Robbins or my personal favorite, Dr. Brene Brown. But to actually put him in a different position, to put him in as God, that feels a little more sticky. I'm happy to discuss Jesus as the original life influencer, but Jesus as God seems a little bit tricky to prove, no? So we're going to move through 3 quick things this morning, 3 common objections that people have to Jesus as God, and then we're going to just quickly go over a couple of things of how those implications impact our lives. You ready? Okay, you're awake. That's good. All right. So, it's not that early, Moses. It's not that early, okay? Number 1, was Jesus just a moral teacher? I'm going to leave you hanging. Is Jesus just a moral teacher? You hear this a lot. The majority of Americans, nearly 52%, and nearly a third of evangelicals say Jesus was a good teacher, but not God, according to a new survey for Ligonier Ministries that was conducted by Lifeway Research. 52%, so over half of Americans, I realize we're in Canada, but over half of Americans believe Jesus was a good teacher. But what's even more surprising is that a third of evangelical Christians would say, I don't know if he was God, I don't think so. Just a good moral teacher. And in my own experience, I hear this a lot. I know a lot of people that would say something along the lines of they feel like Jesus is fine, I don't have a problem with Jesus. I actually think there's a famous quote, I think is it Gandhi? It says something like, I don't have a problem with Jesus, it's your followers I don't like, or something along those lines. That lots of people are A-okay with who Jesus is as a person, but was Jesus just a moral teacher? The short answer is, I don't believe so. And the reason I don't believe so is when we look at the evidence for who Jesus was and the life that he lived, it doesn't allow us to just conclude he was a good moral teacher. So let me get into it. Why? The first one is Jesus fulfilled prophecies. Now, I'm not talking about 1 or 2 prophecies. If you own a Bible or you've seen a Bible is a book that is made up of many books. It is made up of what's considered the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is before Jesus was born. The New Testament is after Jesus is born, chronicling his life and then the beginnings of the early church. And in the Old Testament, There are over 324 prophecies about who Jesus was going to be, who he would be, what his life would be like, how he would die, how he'd be conceived even. It gets really personal. And so there's a lot about who Jesus is, and yet Jesus fulfilled over 324. Now, just to give you, sometimes numbers, like if they don't have any, like we're like, okay, that's cool. But let me give you, this is what's crazy. Because some of these are like, Jesus was born of a virgin. That's not something that Jesus could have just like orchestrated himself, okay? Or Jesus, where he was born. I'm really proud to be from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. But I wasn't like, hey guys, I'd really love you to have me over there. Okay, so Jesus didn't have any control over even some of these prophecies that are before he was born. So let me give you this mathematician. This is crazy. Mathematician Peter Stoner describes the possibility of describing the possibility of just simply fulfilling 8 of these prophecies. We take 10 to the power of 17. I don't even know how many zeros that is. I have a theology degree. No, I mean, like, I don't know how to say that number. You're always my biggest support. Thank you. We take 10 to the power of 17, I don't know how to say that number, stand corrected, and lay them down on the face of Texas. Texas is really big, okay? They will cover the state 2 feet deep. Now mark one of these silver dollars, stir the whole mass thoroughly, blindfold a man and tell him that he must pick up one silver dollar and say that this is the right one. What are the chances that he would have of getting the right one? That's how likely it is that he would fulfill 8 prophecies. Just the same chance that the prophets would have had of writing just 8 prophecies and having them all come true in any one man from their day to the present time, providing they wrote in their own wisdom. This means that the fulfillment of just 8 prophecies alone proves that God inspired the writing of those 8 prophecies to a definitiveness which lacks only one chance in 10 to the power of 17 of being absolute. Basically, for those of you that are not mathematicians, such as myself, as I have already proved, that's nearly impossible. 8 of them. But yet, Jesus fulfills 324. 324. You know how many to the power of zeros that is, Jordan? 157. Say that number. So it is highly unlikely that Jesus would have fulfilled all of these prophecies. So that's the first part, is Jesus fulfilled prophecies. Second of all, Jesus performed miracles. Miracles that we have seen that had eyewitnesses, that there is historical accounts of, not just a theological account, but historical accounts of. Almost 40 miracles are recorded in the Gospels. You might have heard of some of these before. There's Jesus feeds the 5,000. He heals a paralyzed man. He calms a storm. He raises a widow's son. All of these things are very much outside of the explanation of normative human activity. And lastly, I'm trying to go through these quickly so you're not here for 16 hours. The resurrection. I'm going to just really quickly glaze over the resurrection because we're going to go into this a little bit deeper on another week. But it has been corroborated by both Christian and non-Christian scholars and historians over and over again. There are eyewitness accounts of his death, burial, and resurrected self. It is not something that is explainable outside of him being God. And lastly, I'll just share with you these verses because I think it just speaks to how people's understanding of who he was and then who he is changes. And I just love the Bible because we often give people these that are written in the Bible, we give them such a character of oh, well, they're otherworldly, they were in the Bible. But I love it because it really speaks to the common person and the progression of their understanding. So we're going to catch up in Matthew that there's 2 followers of Jesus who are walking on the 3rd day after the crucifixion, after Jesus was killed. And they encounter a man who's walking towards them. He's walking towards Jerusalem. And in Luke 24, it is written, he asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened here over the last few days?" That little bit is my own translation. "What things?" he said. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and before all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped he was the one who was going to come and redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all of this took place. So I just want to highlight for you, he was a prophet. He was powerful in word and deed. So he did all of these things. It was incredible. We thought he was going to be somebody of significance. We thought he was going to be the coming Messiah. They're obviously quite disappointed. It's been 3 days since they crucified him. So then, just to take out a big chunk, they basically invite him back to their place. It's getting late. Come have dinner. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to have it with them. And their eyes were opened as they recognized him. He disappeared from their sight. What a party trick. He disappeared from their sight, and they said, "Were our hearts not burning within us as he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. They found the 11, so that's the apostles, minus Judas, that backstabbing betrayer. They found the 11 who were with them assembled together and said, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Do you see what happened there? That before the resurrection, they were like, "We thought that this was the guy." And then the resurrection happens, and they're like, "This is the Lord." Their demeanor completely changes. So in summary of that point, was Jesus just a moral teacher? Could he have just been a guy that has great answers for life? We can put them on a fridge magnet. But I don't think so, because we see in the life of Jesus that he was so much more than just a moral teacher. He performed things that nobody else could perform. He fulfilled prophecies that nobody else could fulfill with such consistency. But you don't have to take my word for it, because there is a guy, you may or may not have heard of him, by the name of C.S. Lewis. And he wrote a book called Mere Christianity. And this argument, I actually learned, is not his argument originally, but he is the one who has summed it up the best. So I want to share it with you here because it is so perfectly condensed. "I am here trying to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept God as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is one thing we must not say. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would be either a lunatic or on the level of a man who says he is a poached egg. Or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can either shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about him being a great human teacher, for he has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now it seems obvious to me that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God." Who of you are still thinking about poached eggs? Basically, the things that he said, the things that he claimed, the things that he did don't allow us to just think like, yeah, he's got some good sayings. I follow him on TikTok. They don't allow for that because his life was lived in such a way, the things that he proclaimed do not allow us to think of him as anything else. Moving on to point 2, did his followers make it up? Now, I really just want to say, we live in a world where there's a lot of conspiracy theories. So I want to start at the beginning of conspiracy theories and think from the very beginning. First of all, the disciples. They were the 12 followers of Jesus, the original Fab 12. Those men never would have been together if it hadn't have been for Jesus. This is a group of Jewish men of all completely different backgrounds. You've got fishermen, you've got tax collectors. The Jews didn't like tax collectors. The Romans didn't like tax collectors. Nobody liked tax collectors. You've got Simon the Zealot, which is basically like a Jewish nationalist. You've got all of these different people together. Do you think these guys would have come together and been like, this is the man we want? This is who we're going to make up. We're going to pull off this entire hoax that is going to withstand for generations and generations. Probably not. But then you actually look at who Jesus is, and I think to myself, if you look at the credentials of Jesus, I don't think that's the mascot I would have picked. I think I would have picked somebody who, his origins, automatically demanded respect. A king, royalty, some guy who's high up in political circles, some guy who's really got it all together, that would come and set the world straight. He would be a warrior. He would be a guy that would really just be of noble. You would just be so amazed. He probably would float on a cloud. Maybe not. Hoverboard, at least. But yet, Jesus, a man who appears on the scene, who has no title to his name, no significance. If anything, his origins work against him. Isn't that Mary's son? Wasn't there a whole virgin thing? She got pregnant before they got married. That was a big deal back then. What good can come from Nazareth? Jesus the Nazarite. Nazareth wasn't considered a cool place. Think of that place that people said, oh yeah, so-and-so, they're from there. That's the place Jesus was from. I'm not going to name any places. I don't want to make any enemies. I also came from a town that was that place, so I understand. Langford represent. It's fine. Anyways, this man appears on the scene, and there is nothing to him that people would think this is incredible. So how on earth, with all of these odds stacked against him, did Jesus convince the Jewish people he was God? More than that, founding the largest movement and religious faith in the world. Because is that really who you want as your promised Messiah? A nobody of sketchy origins? These guys really need a new PR company, because that is just not the guy to do it. But not only that, but within the Jewish faith, an ancient Jewish faith, they were completely non-disposed to any kind of an embodied God. There was no grounds or precedent set for Jesus' followers to make up a God-man. That was not something within their realm of normal. We're very used to, the flowy-haired Jesus with the Tiva sandals, but that's not something they had on their purview at all. And to make a claim or to put somebody as the image of God, that was directly against. It's written right in the Ten Commandments. You would not put God's name or something as an image. There would be nobody that could embody who that was. They didn't even consider that a human could be God, because Eastern religions, of course, were pantheistic. I am part of God. God is part of everything. Everything is God. And of course, in the Western religions, the Greeks, the Romans, they were very polytheistic. There was a God representative for everything. Some of them would take on the guise of a human, but that was not necessarily a person as God. So for Jewish people, for them to be like, let's make up a man with a robe and a sash. Okay, that's just North America. But that was just not in there. That was not what they would have predicted. It's not what they would have painted as the picture of Jesus. However, Jesus comes as this humble, approachable man in a place that Jews only knew as a chasm of distance between them and God, that there was so much pomp and circumstance and ceremony and cleansing and all of these things, and Jesus comes to them as a man who eats with people that were considered unclean, who touches people that were considered unclean. This is completely not, at least in my perspective, not how they would have painted Jesus. And for anybody who actually would have painted themselves as God, eventually, as we've seen with any kind of cult or any kind of leader who paints themselves as a God figure, eventually their true believers fade away or die out when that person goes away. And yet, that did not happen with the disciples. Second of all, they wouldn't have had doubts. If you're trying to paint this person as a really exciting leader and a God person, you are not going to also say, I've got some doubts about him. But we see, even throughout the Gospels, that his disciples, he rebukes his disciples for not having faith. In Mark 4, verse 40, he says to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Why do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." That there's these moments where they're caught in a storm and Jesus calms the waves and calms the storm and they're all shocked and he's like, hello, like, have you not seen what I can do? I don't think I'd be wanting people to record that I wasn't totally sure if I'm going to make this guy like legit. And lastly, and I think this is probably the one that speaks to Jesus' intent the best, is Jesus had plenty of opportunity to correct the errors in their thinking if they mistakenly believed Jesus was claiming to be God. Thomas worshiped Jesus. We see this in John, and he says, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus tells him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not yet seen and yet have believed." So he's not saying, no, that's not who I am, you've got it wrong. He's responding with, like, he's commending him. He's not condemning him. He's like, that's right. Blessed are those who receive and believe. And we see it again at his trial before he is crucified, that even the religious leaders in the end of Matthew, chapter 26, he says, the high priest says to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus responds, "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." He had plenty of time to jump in front of that and say, no, that's not who I am. But yet he did not. So I think that if the disciples had either been on the wrong track, that they had gotten it wrong and they had had the wrong idea of who Jesus was, Jesus would have stopped them. Or I don't think that Jesus is the kind of man that you make up. I don't think who he was and all of his unexpected twists and turns was the kind of thing that people would be expecting when they make up a God figure. To continue to worship such a man, write letters, witness conversions of the most unlikely sort when there were still hundreds of eyewitnesses alive. If he had tried to downplay the talk of divinity, there would have been a split in the new religion. Those that worshipped him as God and those that only claimed him to be a man with no other evidence. Jesus' followers only worshipped him as God. So much so that almost all of them went to their death because of their belief in Jesus. That's a pretty significant sacrifice if you've only known a guy 3 years. That I believe and I am so sold out for the truth of who this person is that I will go to my death for him. Second point, did he really claim to be God? Don't worry, we're going to pick it up from here. There are those that would argue that Jesus never really claimed that. People assumed it, but they didn't really claim it. The claim that Jesus is both a person of great impact, as in brilliant teaching, building a following of millions, that he's not the first one to do that. We see that with all sorts of people. We see all sorts of characters that have considered they've got wisdom to share, and we repost it and we retweet it. But also, there are those, and a very select few, who have claimed to be God. Often, not many followers for those ones, I might add. There's not many followers for those that claim to be God, except for Jesus. But Jesus did both. Jesus was a teacher of brilliance and great impact, and he claimed to be God. It is the unique attribute of Jesus that he is both a member of the first sect and the second. While in many ways the first set have absolutely admirable attributes and teaching, many have been very explicit that they are not in fact God. This includes other world religions. Buddha, of course Muhammad, he would never claim to be Allah. And of course, there are those that claim to be God that have never convinced more than a handful of true believers. Once upon a time, we had an evening service at our church in Victoria, and we're right downtown. And we have all sorts of different people that come into our evening service. And after the service, I was talking to a man, and he was telling me these spiritual experiences he had had. And I was like, wow, that's incredible. That's an incredible story. And he's sharing all of this with me. And then he goes, well, now I am God. And I was like, this just took a left-hand turn. I was not expecting that was going to be the next thing out of his mouth. But basically, after he said that, everything he said from that point on, I was like, neat. And it completely changed his credibility to me in what he was saying, and I took that with a very large heap of salt. Not a grain, but a heap. So imagine this nobody from Nazareth comes and starts talking about the authority of God in his teachings. And he's saying, you see, when the paralytic is lowered through the ceiling in Luke, he says, friends, your sins are forgiven. That's something that is only reserved for God. And then you also hear him say things like in John, he says, Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. To know him is to know God. And in ancient Jewish culture, to say I am the son of so-and-so, that automatically means you have inherited their authority, their estate, their everything. That you are, in their mind, you are speaking on behalf of this person, you are this person. So for him to say, I am the son of God, that is equating himself and giving the same authority to him as God has. And we see again, as he says in John, I'm going to skim through these real fast. I think they're going to be up on the screen. Very truly, I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. At this, they picked up their stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. We see it again in John 10. My Father has given them to me, is greater than all. No one can snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and the Father are one. Again, his Jewish opponents picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus said to them, I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? And they say, we are not stoning you for your good works, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you are a mere man who claims to be God. The religious leaders are so angry. Why? Not because of the things he's doing, but because who he's claiming to be. Which right there tells us Jesus definitely claimed to be God. So at this point, I want to ask the worship team if they want to come back. We can summarize and understand these arguments of who Jesus is, of who his followers would have said he is. But if at the end of this, our idea or our truth is that Jesus is Lord, to truly put Jesus in the place of divinity requires two things from us. Actually, it requires a lot of things, but we're only going to cover two. Jesus as Lord requires submission. If we can conclude that Jesus is divine, Jesus is Lord, lordship means ruling power. It means we are recognizing and giving authority to that person. And Jesus, he didn't just say, understand that I am Lord, understand that I'm God. He didn't just say, believe that. He said, follow him. Something that was passive versus something that is active. There's a very real difference between those two things. And in North America, in our lives based in freedom, we can say we believe in Jesus. That doesn't cost us anything. To say we follow Jesus, that means that there is activity, there is motion, there is intentionality. I often say my dad has an amazing sense of direction. If you were here last week, he was the man in the polo shirt with fishing lures on it, his dressy outfit for a special occasion. But that should speak to his outdoorsy ways. And one time we were lost in a park, and like a big wooded park, not like a play park. And it was pouring rain. I had 2 kids in the stroller. We had our dogs with us, and it's a park that I go to frequently. We were kind of in an area I wasn't used to, and we had to get back to pick up my oldest from school. And he said, I think we should go this way. I said, I think we should go that way. I said, the car's that way. He goes, no, I think we need to go this way and a loop around. And that was a moment where I had to give up my own authority and trust in myself and think, I know this guy knows directions better than I do. He's got like an internal compass that I don't have. And I followed him, and spoiler alert, we made it out of the park, down the path he said. And for us to submit our lives, sometimes we're okay to submit our lives to our personal trainer or our veterinarian or our neurosurgeon, people that obviously know more, know better than us. But to submit our lives to Jesus, that feels, I know me. I know what's best for me. I'm going to do what's best for me. We get nervous, don't we, when our autonomy is challenged of our freedom. I don't think there's any better example than this last couple years. We have people that are upset being told what to do. We have people that are upset that those people aren't doing what they're doing. we challenged our freedom a lot in whatever camp you landed in. This is not any kind of a COVID statement. We get snarly about that. But ultimately, God gave us this gift. God gave us free will. And for us to make the decision to follow him has to come from a place of free will. We've been given that gift, and it is only when we choose to follow him that we are actually exercising that free will and that submission, that we are submitting ourselves to God. Second of all, following Jesus requires holiness. Submission and holiness, Amy, that's what you're leading with? When we submit our lives to Jesus, it requires something of us. It requires to be set apart, to live different, to be different, following the way that Jesus lived, which was different. Jesus didn't just anger those guys that were kind of the whoever's of society, nobody really cared. Jesus angered the religious leaders as well, because he didn't fall into one of those camps, the Gentiles or the Jews. Jesus made a new way. Jesus was doing something different. And the opposite of holy, we often think is sin, or we'd use a word like that, but the opposite of holy is common. To be set apart, to be consecrated. Consecrate might not be a word you're familiar with, but to be consecrated is to be used for special purpose or service. How we live our lives, what we do with our money, how we steward relationships, our generosity, our compassion, all of those things, God has something to say about. And it looks different than the common flow of culture. That is to live holy, to live consecrated. That's what happens when we choose to have Jesus as Lord, Jesus as divine, Jesus as God. And in the immortal words of Timothy Keller, Dr. Timothy Keller, in his amazing book, Making Sense of God, he concludes with these thoughts on Jesus as God. So at the heart of the evidence for Christianity is a great conundrum. Here is a man who claimed to be God and yet lived a life so great that he became the only person to convince a sizable part of humanity that he was God. How do we account for that? I have argued that we can't be indifferent to such a claim. We can't resolve the issues by saying he was only a great teacher because his declarations don't allow for that. We can't respond that he never made such a claim because the historical evidence doesn't allow for that. We can't be content by the explanation that he was deranged or a fraud because the evident wisdom, greatness, and impact of his life on his followers, and because of the case for the resurrection. This leaves us with one final possible explanation, namely, that he is who he says he is. As hard as it is to believe that he is God come to earth, it may be just as difficult not to. Is it really impossible for God to become human? Why, if God is really all-powerful, could he have not done it? And why, if God is really all-loving, would he have not done it? This is who I want God to be. Obviously, this doesn't answer every objection and every question to faith in Christianity. Of course, no 30-minute talk could. But I would say at the very least, it is the beginning of a primer for the significance of Jesus. Why we're still talking about a man that lived on this earth 2,000 years ago. Jesus presents a pathway, a scaffolding to know God more fully, more intimately, in a way that is more than just a manifesto, but is a literal manifestation or embodiment of God. Jesus is Lord, untamed, tender, irreducible, paradoxically humble, consistently selfless. And that is the image of God that through Jesus we get to behold. So Father, we thank you for your Son. God, we thank you that you loved us so much that you sent your Son to earth to show us who you are, God, to show us how much you love people, how there is space and room at the table for all people. God, how you've lavished compassion on us, how you've lavished joy and life to the full, God. So God, would you just open our eyes and open our ears today, God, for how you may be speaking and revealing yourself to us today. God, may this just be an invitation to know God more fully. Perhaps there are those in the room that don't have a relationship with God. God, I pray that today would be a landmark on their spiritual journey as they explore more fully who is Jesus, as they come to a revelation of Jesus as Lord of their lives. So, Lord, I pray for fresh conviction. I pray for fresh prompting in our spirits, Lord, of the things that we have perhaps held onto and done our own way. God, I pray that there would be transformation in the safety and security of a loving God, of a God who cares so much that he sent his Son so we could know him better. We love you, Jesus.